The town of Braunau am Inn lay quietly beside the slow-moving Austrian river, as if it were holding its breath between two centuries. The cobbled streets smelled of rain and wood smoke, and the church bell tolled each morning with an echo that seemed far older than the town itself. It was a place where people worked, prayed, and endured, a world untouched by greatness or ruin. It was in this sleepy border town, on a cool April evening in 1889, that Adolf Hitler entered the world. A thunderstorm had rolled in from the mountains, rattling the window panes as midwife and mother wrestled with pain and prayer. When the infant's first cry rose over the storm, it mingled with the rumble of thunder, a sound both ordinary and ominous. His father, Alois, stood in the doorway, tall, proud, and stern, wearing the uniform of a retired customs officer. His face was carved with lines of duty, his mustache sharp as his temper. His mother, Clara, was gentle, almost fragile, her eyes the pale blue of spring sky, eyes that would later fill with endless sorrow. In that small, candlelit room, no one could have known that this child, born between Austria and Germany, between empire and change, would one day redefine the meaning of power and the cost of silence. Adolf's childhood was not one of laughter. His father ruled the household like a soldier commanding a post. Every meal was a ceremony of order, every mistake an offense. When Adolf faltered in his studies or spoke with defiance, his father's leather belt delivered lessons harsher than words. The boy learned early that tears brought no mercy, only more anger. But in the evenings, when his father's boot stopped pacing and his voice no longer thundered, Adolf would retreat to a corner with paper and pencil. He would draw, endlessly. Houses, castles, churches, faces. His lines were clean and precise, as if he sought control over a world that refused him peace. His mother watched quietly, her hands often trembling as she embroidered by lamplight. She saw in him something delicate, perhaps too delicate for a world ruled by men like Alois. She would press her hand to his hair and whisper, "My little Adi, you are different." He was. When Adolf was 6, the family moved to Passau, a border city where the rivers Inn and Danube met like two lifelines of history. Here he saw soldiers parade through the streets, their uniforms glinting like sunlight on steel. He was mesmerized, not by war, for he did not yet understand it, but by order, the way men marched in unison, the way flags rippled as if alive. It stirred something inside him, a longing to belong to something greater, something unbreakable. But belonging never came easily. At school he struggled. His teachers found him distracted, lost in his imagination. He could spend hours staring out the window watching clouds drift like marching armies across the sky. When corrected, he would flush red and tremble with prideful anger, the same pride that once filled his father's voice. Alois demanded he prepare for a career in civil service, perhaps as a clerk like himself, but Adolf recoiled at the thought. To him, the idea of sitting behind a desk was a kind of death. He wanted to create, not calculate. He wanted to be seen. One afternoon, after another argument about his future, Adolf fled to the nearby woods. There he sat for hours beneath a birch tree, sketching the outlines of a grand cathedral, one that existed only in his mind. When he finally returned home, his mother was waiting with tears in her eyes, and his father with a strap in his hand. The strap fell, and something inside the boy hardened forever. As years passed, death became a familiar visitor. First, his younger brother Edmund died of measles. A small coffin, a small grave, a silence that never quite left their home. Clara prayed harder, her rosary worn smooth from use. Alois grew colder still, his grief turning to bitterness. The family moved again, this time to Limbach, where Adolf attended a monastery school run by Benedictine monks. The monastery was a world of candlelight and incense, of Latin hymns echoing through stone halls. The young boy was drawn to it, not for faith, but for the ceremony, the priest's robes, the processions, the authority of it all. These things imprinted themselves deep within his mind. Years later, when he stood before thousands, raising his hand in salute, some who had known him as a child said the motion resembled the monk's blessing. But at home the tension only grew. Alois's health was failing, yet his discipline never softened. One winter morning, after scolding his son for another poor grade, he clutched his chest and fell to the floor. The old man's authority ended in a single heartbeat. Adolf watched as his mother knelt beside the lifeless figure, sobbing, her hands shaking. He felt no relief, only confusion. The shadow that had dominated his childhood was gone, but in its place was emptiness. The family's fortunes dwindled. Clara moved them to Linz, hoping for stability. Adolf grew quiet, withdrawn, but his drawings multiplied. His mother supported his dream of art school even when others laughed. She saved coins, bought him brushes, and smiled when he spoke of Vienna, that shining city of culture and possibility. For a moment, it seemed hope had returned. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. In the autumn of 1907, Clara fell ill with breast cancer. The illness came like a thief, taking her strength day by day. Adolf, now 18, nursed her devotedly, mixing medicines, reading by her bedside, holding her hand as she gasped for air. When she finally died that December, he collapsed beside her body, weeping in a way no one had ever seen. The doctor who treated her wrote later that he had never witnessed grief so raw. That night, in the quiet house, Adolf sat alone at the kitchen table. The lamp burned low. Outside, snow fell over the town, soft and merciless. He took one of her mother's rosaries, placed it in his pocket, and whispered, "Everything I was died with her." The next morning, he packed his sketches and boarded a train to Vienna. The train to Vienna rumbled through the winter landscape like a ghost of iron and smoke. Adolf sat by the window, clutching a worn suitcase and a folder of sketches, his mother's rosary still in his coat pocket. The world outside blurred into white fields and black forests, as if heaven and earth had lost their color. Vienna, when it finally appeared, was overwhelming, a vast maze of boulevards, domes, and carriages. The city pulsed with life and arrogance. It was the beating heart of an empire, where kings and beggars walked the same streets, though never side by side. Adolf stepped onto the platform at the Westbahnhof, shivering, not from the cold, but from awe. For a moment he forgot his grief. The city seemed to whisper to him, promising destiny, greatness, and a chance to be seen. He rented a small room on Stumpergasse, barely large enough for a bed and an easel. By day he wandered the city, studying buildings, sketching arches, tracing the outlines of cathedrals. By night, he sat beneath a dim oil lamp, copying his drawings into neat portfolios. His dream was simple and pure, to be accepted into the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna. In his mind, it was not just an art school, it was salvation. When spring came, he gathered his best works and presented them proudly at the Academy gates. Inside, the marble floors gleamed, the air smelled of varnish and genius. Young men with confident faces carried canvases that seemed alive. Adolf handed his folder to the examiner, a tall man with spectacles and paint-stained fingers. The man flipped through the sketches without expression, pausing only briefly before closing the folder.
"Your architectural drawings show promise," the man said finally, "but your figures lack life. Art requires the human soul, not just structure. The word struck like a hammer. Rejected. The dream collapsed in silence. He returned to his rented room, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall. His sketches lay scattered on the floor, pale and meaningless. For days he hardly ate. His savings dwindled. The city grew colder. Yet in the quiet, something else began to grow, a whisper of resentment. He told himself it was unfair, that the academy did not see his talent, that the system was blind. But deeper down, the pain was more personal. The world had once again said no to him. He tried again the next year, applying once more to the academy. This time, he wasn't even granted an interview. His folder was returned unopened. Vienna had spoken clearly. He would never be an artist. Pride turned to shame, shame to anger. He drifted between lodging houses, selling postcards of city scenes he painted himself. The money was small, the loneliness immense. He began to spend his evenings in cheap cafes, listening to conversations about politics, art, and destiny. In those smoky rooms, amid the clatter of cups and the hum of discontent, the first sparks of ideology began to form. Vienna was a city divided between rich and poor, empire and decay, old faith and new doubt. Newspapers screamed of scandals, revolutions, and the growing influence of Jewish bankers and intellectuals. Adolphe, wounded and desperate for someone to blame, began to absorb the poison that filled the air. The hatred was not his invention, but it found in him a willing vessel. He often wandered near the Ringstrasse, staring up at the grand buildings, the parliament, the opera house, the museums, all symbols of power he could only observe from the outside. To him, the city became a stage on which he was not allowed to perform. Each rejection deepened his obsession with greatness. He began to see the world not as individuals, but as forces, strong and weak, pure and corrupt, deserving and undeserving. It was here, among Vienna's glittering facades and dark alleys, that the child of war's shadow truly began to take shape. The quiet, grieving son turned into a restless dreamer, angry at a world that refused to recognize him. At night, he would wander the banks of the Danube, watching the water move endlessly toward the east. "Someday they will see," he whispered. But who they were, he could not yet say. The years rolled on, marked by hunger and humiliation. In 1909, he found himself homeless, sleeping beneath bridges and in shelters for the poor. Vienna's charm had faded into cruelty. The same city that once dazzled him now seemed to mock him with every lighted window, every carriage passing by. He watched men in fine coats step over beggars, and women in pearls ignore the hungry children clutching their skirts. The hypocrisy disgusted him. Yet even as he cursed the world, he began to feel something dangerous, a strange sense of destiny. He began to believe that his suffering was not meaningless, but preparation, that the pain was shaping him for something far greater. It was the only way to survive the cold. In the shelter's reading room, he discovered books on German nationalism, pamphlets, essays and speeches that spoke of unity, pride, and racial destiny. He devoured them, word by word, as if they were scripture. The words gave form to his anger, turning personal failure into ideological purpose. He would later recall, "It was in Vienna that I learned the world." But what he learned was not compassion, but resentment disguised as revelation. He came to see the Jews not as neighbors, but as symbols of corruption and decay, echoes of the hateful rhetoric that filled the city's streets. The bitterness that began with his father's belt, that deepened with his mother's death and the Academy's rejection, now found a target. He was no longer simply a failed artist. He was a man searching for meaning in blame. And yet, beneath the layers of anger, a trace of the dreamer still remained. He still painted postcards of Vienna's old cathedrals, bridges, and city squares. People bought them without knowing who he was. Some smiled at the detail, the beauty. He took their coins with silent pride. For a brief moment, as he brushed color across paper, he could pretend he still belonged to the world. But when the paint dried and the night returned, the shadow came back, the same shadow that had followed him since childhood, whispering of power, of destiny, of vengeance. The boy from Braunau was still searching for a place in history. He just didn't know yet how dark that place would be.